that what I'm about to say in the next 3 minutes may not be as more important than anything I've ever said, speaking from 1,000 stages around the country. All of us remember Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. Well, this is my 3-minute "I Have a Dream" speech. And that dream is that everybody in this room will cease and desist using the word carbon when you are talking about carbon dioxide, and that if you're in the presence of anybody talking about carbon when they mean carbon dioxide, that you will interrupt them and explain what is correct. And I have 9 statements I'm going to read to you, and if any of you would like them, just email me and I'll send them to you. But they're simple statements that support my premise. The first is, and I think you'll agree, that the use of the word carbon has been a deliberate fraud intended to deceive the public. Carbon is not a synonym for carbon dioxide. Carbon is generally a solid occurring as soot, coal dust, lamp black, and also a very strong fiber. Carbon dioxide is not a contaminant or a pollutant. Carbon dioxide is a colorless, odorless gas. Carbon dioxide is what we humans exhale and what vegetation uses to keep our planet alive. Carbon dioxide is the miracle molecule of life. They want to tax something? Fine, tax soot, tax carbon black, tax coal dust, not carbon dioxide. If we make our language precise and use the term carbon dioxide when it is intended, it will no longer elicit fear among the public as a pollutant. This is a small thing to ask. Understand again, our enemy, the opposition, the anti-fossil fuel people that basically want to starve our planet, have been doing this purposely for 2 decades. And it's time that everybody in this audience begin correcting it. I actually believe in a year or 2, if this simple message gets out, we can begin to turn the tide and make the public less fearful of fossil fuels and the carbon dioxide that is emitted from them. So that is my message. I am very hopeful that you will all take it home. If you'd like a copy of those simple 9 statements, email me and I'll send them to you. We have 3 wonderful speakers on our panel today. I'll just tell you about each of them very quickly, and then they will begin. The first one will be David Delegates. David is a professor of climatology at the University of Delaware, and he is most recently famous for publishing a phenomenal paper putting the lie to the absurd statement that 97% of the public, of scientists, believe that man is responsible for global warming. It's a lengthy, detailed paper, and if you get your hands on it and read it, you'll have information to laugh at the people who love to tell you that 97% of scientists believe man is warming the globe. Our next speaker will be Amanda Maxim. She's someone you'll really enjoy meeting, and I really recommend you read her bio in the program. She has a PhD in astrophysics, and her specialty is gamma ray burst astronomy, a subject I'm sure you're all want to learn more about, and you can if you chat with Amanda. But she has also become an amazing science journalist, being published widely on a wide variety of environmental as well as energy issues. Our final speaker will be Roy Spencer. Roy is the second most famous person in the University of Alabama system. Anyone here want to tell me who the most famous person is? I think I heard it. It's Nick Saban, the football coach. But Roy Spencer and John Christie have won awards from NASA for their work on measuring the Earth's temperature with satellites, and you will enjoy his presentation coming up the rear. So first up, David Legates.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to talk about today is the question, is carbon dioxide a pollutant or a benefit? And listening to Jay's talk, you now know what answer I must come up with. But in any event, we've all heard that carbon dioxide, of course, is a pollutant. It drives climate. It is the single most important factor that determines what the climate's going to be in the future and what the temperature is going to be and how much precipitation there's going to be, so much so that we have to put a danger sign on carbon dioxide. But the question I really want to ask is it really a benefit? Not just simply, has it gotten a bad rap, but is it really something that we could do with a little bit more? Here's a carbon dioxide concentration at Mauna Loa Observatory. You can see it sawtooths up. You can see the seasonal cycle. It's gone up by about a third since the middle of the last century, and most of that's due to human activity. But let me start you with a quote. This is from Sylvan Whitwer. He's an agronomist who serves as director of the Agricultural Experiment Station at Michigan State University. He said, "It should be considered good fortune that we are living in a world of gradually increasing levels of atmospheric CO2. The rising level of atmospheric CO2 and a universally premium, gaining in magnitude with time, in which we can all reckon for the foreseeable future." Well, let's look at somebody on the opposite side of the spectrum. This is Ms. Janine Benyus. She's the Rachel Carson Environmental Ethics Award winner. I'll let you think about that for a moment. She said, "Organisms don't think of CO2 as a poison. Plants and organisms that make shells, coral, think of it as a building block." And indeed, if you think about photosynthesis, we need carbon dioxide, we need water, we need energy, and we put together the sugars that essentially makes life and makes life grow. In fact, greenhouses, professional greenhouses already knew this. And if you go to any high-end commercial greenhouse, you'll find one of these boxes or one by another company. But essentially, it enriches the carbon dioxide inside the greenhouse to 2, 3, or 4 times the natural concentration. Why is that? Because they already know what we already know, which is it causes plants to grow faster and improves plant quality. This is a famous shot from Sherwood Itso. Here is ambient CO2. He took a little seedling, grew it in 350 parts per million. By a certain time, it had grown to the size of about up to his belt buckle. One growing at 500 parts per million had grown up to sort of the middle of his chest. One growing in 650 parts per million had grown to about the top of his neck. And one growing at about 800 parts per million are essentially grown to about the size of him. So more carbon dioxide provides more building blocks, and we know that plants, therefore, tend to grow more. Here, same thing happens with peas. Here's 97 parts per million, 127 parts per million with pea plants, and if you grow them in increased carbon dioxide concentrations, you can see that the pea plant grows faster and you get more pea growth. I think this is, not sure what it is off the top of my head. Any event, it's another plant. Sorry, I'm not an agriculturalist. It's dropped my name. Any event, 461, 781, 1218, alfalfa, thank you, essentially is more of it you get. So we go to the climatologists, and the climatologist from the second U.S. National Assessment tells us for corn and soybean temperature response, they give us this little outlet block, and if we look at it closely, you can see, maybe I lost the advance. There we go. You can see that it says for corn will fail to reproduce at temperatures above 95 Fahrenheit, and in particular, the optimum temperature of corn growth occurs at about 81 Fahrenheit. You can see we're not going to get corn growing over much of the United States, and particularly not in the summertime, because a large portion of the United States go above 95 Fahrenheit. The concern, of course, is as temperatures rise, this is going to get worse and worse. And the same holds for soybeans. Now, I was talking to a gentleman who's sitting down in the front row, and he said essentially, but we're growing corn in Phoenix. And I said, you can't be growing corn in Phoenix. It's way too hot for corn. As you can see here, the climatologists tell us corn will fail to grow at temperatures above 95 Fahrenheit. And I know enough about Phoenix, it gets above 95 Fahrenheit. And he said, yeah, it does, but we still grow corn. So I said, well, how can that be? So we went to Iowa State University's agronomy department, course number 541, I think is a graduate level course, and found the following, which says the ideal temperature for crop growth, this being corn, if everything else is satisfactory, such as nutrition and water availability, is somewhere around 93 Fahrenheit. Common corn varieties will not grow below 49 and will grow fastest at 93 Fahrenheit. And you look at the curve, you can see it's fairly flat, which means we would expect corn to be growing somewhere between Colorado and Delaware and somewhere between Texas and North Dakota. Indeed, it does. So the question is, why are we being told something different? The interesting thing is there's two other issues that carbon dioxide brings to the table. First issue is that if you look at the idea that more carbon dioxide means plants will be more water efficient. In this case, you can see well-watered conditions, you can see water-stressed conditions, but in both conditions, more carbon dioxide means you use less water. The idea is you have stomates on the underside of plants. They open up to allow gaseous exchange. If you open them up to allow more carbon dioxide in, you open them up wider to allow more water vapor to escape. So if the carbon dioxide concentration is higher, they don't need to lose as much water and they become much more water efficient. Here's an article that came out last year. Rising carbon dioxide is making the world's plants more water wise. And the quote for them is, global change is causing the world's plants to grow in a more water efficient way because land plants are absorbing 17% more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than just 30 years ago. We also know the second thing happens. That is, as more carbon dioxide goes in the atmosphere, the actual optimum growing temperature shifts to a higher temperature. Here you can see with 325 parts per million CO2 versus 1935 parts per million CO2, the temperature shifts to an optimum temperature that's warmer. The growth is greater at all temperature ranges, but you can see the optimum growing temperature shifts to a warmer temperature range. So more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere brings about a warmer planet, but also the plants are designed in such a way that warmer planets, more carbon dioxide also gives you much more growth. So we conclude, therefore, that the net effect of elevated CO2 is twofold. One is that it uses less water, and two, that it produces more food. What you would expect it, therefore, that this would be a greener planet. And if we look at the conditions here based on change in leaf area from 1982 to 2015, indeed you can see the greens are associated with greening, the reds are associated with less greening. There are places where there are red. Much of that is urbanization effects and so forth. But if you look at most of the planet, you can see that most of the grasses, most of the large areas of forest and so forth have become greener over that last 35, 40 years. Long-lived trees are also growing faster. These are the bristlecoat pines, lumber pines, tall, foxtail pines that live to be 1,000, 2,000 years old. You can see that generally their rate of growth has increased as the carbon dioxide has increased in the late 20th century. I'll give you a quote from President Jimmy Carter. He said, "The path to global peace is to raise the standard of living of millions of rural people who live in poverty by increasing agricultural productivity. A thriving agriculture is the engine that fuels broader economic growth and development." And indeed, if we go back to Sylvan Whitwer, the quote is, "The rising level of atmospheric CO2 could be simply that one global natural resource that is progressively increasing food production and total biological output. Both developing and developed countries are and will be sharing equally. In this case, a rising tide will float both boats, developed nations of the world and developing nations. And this is important because much of the planet involves a lot of poor people that need food to exist. Getting food, keeping food, getting refrigeration, things like that is very difficult. But if we're able to produce more plants due to increased carbon dioxide, that is a good thing, particularly for them. But remember, most of the ocean, or remember, most of the land surface, or the Earth's surface, is ocean. And as a result, one of the concerns that Jane Luchenko brought up was the fact that carbon dioxide dissolves into the ocean, producing carbonic acid. Carbonic acid, therefore, lowers the pH, and that potentially brings about what she called osteoporosis of the sea. The hard parts of familiar animals are made of calcium carbonate, which will dissolve. And so she shows pictures like this where you have shells dying under low pH conditions. Only over a period of about 45 days, they've gone essentially from hard shells to effectively goo. So I looked at a couple other areas, and this is research by Justin Rees from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Here is a Louisiana crawfish, at 400 parts per million. And if we grow one at 2,800 parts per million, they get bigger and more delicious. Blue crabs at 400 parts per million, instead of having the shells disappear, they also get bigger and more delicious. So where does this difference come from? In fact, if we go back to Science magazine, here's an article by Iglesias Rodriguez and colleagues in 2008. They concluded that increased atmospheric CO2 also enhances marine life, in contradiction to these previous claims where lower pH in the ocean was said to be dissolving calcium carbonate. In particular, she went on to note that what people were doing was changing the pH by adding hydrochloric acid. You add more acid, you lower the pH, and essentially the calcium carbonate was dissolving. The problem is that's not what's happening in the real world. We're producing not more hydrochloric acid, but more carbonic acid. And as a result, the chemistry for carbonic acid is different for hydrochloric acid. And when you do it the correct way, by bubbling in carbon dioxide and producing more carbonic acid, essentially things don't go horribly wrong, but instead the plants and animals grow more. Particularly the growth of phytoplankton, which in the oceans is the initial building block, the small plants that start everything in the food chain. We get more of them, and we get bigger plants and so forth. Now, I gave this talk previously, and what happened was one of the dioxide positively. Is it more water efficient? Does it grow better under increased carbon dioxide? The answer is yes. How about, oops, wrong direction. How about silver birch, another tree? The answer is yes. How about yellow poplar? The answer is yes. Well, let's get off trees and go to grasses. How about grasslands in general? The answer is yes. We can look at green algae. And the answer again is yes. We can look at purple sea urchins. We can look at desert lizards, and they grow and do better. And in particular, if we go back, we've seen corn, we've seen soybeans, but if we start to look at some of the more important crops that produce food for people, we see wheat, the answer is yes. We see rice, the answer is yes. We see tomato, the answer is yes. And we see cowpea. And the answer is, of course, yes. I'm sorry. Cowpea, yes. And the answer is yes. Now, thank you. Don't encourage me, please. If we go on, I mean, I could be here all day, but lunch is coming up, and you also want to hear two other distinguished people talk. Go to co2science.org, which was put together by Craig and Sherwood Itzo. You literally can go to page after page where they keep a record of how different plants, you can see bamboo, I can see in there beets, so forth. Like I say, I won't go through all of them, of course, but how they respond to changes in carbon dioxide concentrations and how essentially they become much more water efficient and grow better as carbon dioxide concentrations go up. So the answer to my question, is carbon dioxide a pollutant or a benefit? It clearly isn't a pollutant. It is definitely a benefit, and we can do with a little bit more of it. Thank you very much.
Bigger lobsters, eh? How does a lobster answer the phone? Shallow. All right, now we got that over with. Let's begin. All right. My slides up. Do I talk to myself? No. Ah. Okay. On a stormy afternoon in June of 1752, Benjamin Franklin rushed outside to fly a kite. With a metal key attached to a silk string, Franklin found incontrovertible proof that lightning was indeed an electrical phenomenon. Seeing the practicality of taming nature, just months later, Franklin invented the lightning rod. It's a slender piece of metal to put atop of rooftops to guide lightning safely to the ground. His invention immediately began saving lives. Those buildings which installed them no longer caught fire during a storm. But despite this obvious benefit, Franklin was dismayed that his invention was not more widely and readily accepted. Instead, lightning rods were met with prejudice and fear. People could see that lightning caused fires and struck people down, but they believed Franklin's unholy rod would be a cure or curse worse than the cure. Lightning was seen as a symbol of God's wrath, and it was considered impious and dangerous to interfere. If God's wrath was diverted with the lightning rod, he would surely strike out with a vengeance elsewhere. Representatives of the church spread fear about lightning rods thick on an unsure public, blaming them for earthquakes, for example. The preferred method for the church for protecting people from lightning was to send bell ringers up in the storm. The pealing of holy bells could stave off God, people thought. And of course, many bell ringers, often up in the highest tower in the town, lost their lives to lightning strikes. There were lawsuits filed neighbor against neighbor demanding that lightning rods be removed from houses. They were torn down from buildings across Europe and America by angry mobs. Even the Institute of Bologna, the most prestigious institute of science in Italy at the time, removed theirs because of public superstition. People believed that if lightning was God's will, interfering was morally wrong and would have dire consequences. May we place rods on our houses to guard them from lightning without being guilty of presumption. Presumption in this context means arrogance towards God. Franklin's group of trusted colleagues discussed this question because people would need an answer in order to be ready to use the lightning rod. St. Bride's Steeple in London was a frequent victim of lightning strikes, and when it was going to be repaired in 1768, 16 years after the invention of the lightning rod, it was going to be repaired without one. John Winthrop, professor of Harvard, wrote to Franklin about St. Bride's. He said, quote, "How astonishing is the force of prejudice in an age of so much knowledge and free inquiry," unquote. As Philip Dray, a Franklin biographer, put it, the lightning rod raised a question to the world that people were unsure to answer. Was it morally right for mankind to interfere with nature, or were we better and safer to accept the hand that Providence deals, no matter how terrible? Is it morally right to interfere with nature? You might take a moment to consider yourself. Who would you be in that situation, in that story? Would you be the cleric preaching for precaution, non-interference, and ultimately death and destruction? Would you be a first adopter, anxious to get the facts and to ensure your family's safety? Would you be one of Franklin's men, demonstrating the rod's efficacy and safety and taking a stand against Providence? Would you be one of the superstitious hordes? Given the knowledge and context that you would have at the time, would you be unsure what to do? What would convince you? Before our picture changes too much, I'd like to bring you back to the present day. We as modern men like to think of these scares as a thing of the past. After all, people aren't so religious anymore. Hopefully, there's many more atheists like me out there in the world. And we get science now, right? Even the most ignorant among us has access to a world of information brimming right at the tips of our fingertips. As much as that Harvard professor was right to be proud of his age, don't we have even more reason to be proud of our age of so much knowledge and free inquiry? Today, a story like this seems laughable. But before you say, ha ha ha, those silly colonists, you may want to consider whether you've really answered this question. Is it morally right to interfere with nature? Our frame of reference may have changed, but the same question is being asked of us today. And your answer matters. Since ideas influence the course of history, that means that how individual voices answer this question adds up to a culture. It determines the course of the future. And there's a lot of life-enhancing technology at stake. In this talk, I will talk about fossil fuels, one of those life-enhancing technologies. I think for most people today, the answer has been that it is morally wrong to interfere with nature. It's wrong to choose the betterment of individual human lives when bettering those lives comes up against leaving nature alone. And it always comes up against leaving nature alone. Just as you can't understand the reaction to the lightning rod without considering the morality behind it, I put it to you that you can't understand what's happening with carbon dioxide and fossil fuels without understanding that this is primarily a moral debate, not a scientific one. Our culture seems obsessed with carbon dioxide. It's categorized as a dangerous pollutant. The general consensus is that we should be using, quote, carbon-free sources of energy, such as solar or wind, no matter how expensive and inefficient and scarce those are. You can go online and calculate your carbon footprint. In other words, you can see how much carbon dioxide your activities create, such as driving to work, riding on airplanes, eating meat, even the size of your home. Businesses and individuals are all interested in reducing their carbon dioxide footprints. And when it comes to carbon footprints, the smaller, the better, we're told. In other words, the amount of carbon dioxide that you put into the atmosphere is a measure of your guilt. Your carbon footprint is your sin against nature. And we're told that Mother Nature will strike back with a vengeance. So consider carbon dioxide for a moment. With every breath you take, you exhale it. It's a waste product that arises from your life. And it's not just human beings that exhale carbon dioxide. Our machines do too. And human beings thrive to the extent that we live in a machine civilization versus one that's based on manual labor. So let's change our frame of reference. I'm an astronomer, and so I like to think of the Earth, or of our planet, from the outside looking in. Some who are looking for signs of intelligent life on other planets are looking for some of the gas products of a machine-based civilization, such as carbon dioxide, methane, chlorofluorocarbons. These could be signs of advanced forms of life, the same way that they would be signs to aliens looking through their telescopes out at us. On Earth, carbon dioxide is a sign of advanced life because human beings require, because human beings require energy in order to thrive. Energy allows a single man to do the work of many men. Earthman can do many such jobs in a single day. For example, I can cook breakfast, I can drive my children to school, I can wash clothes, I can transport groceries, all in the span of a single morning. I, of course, do other things. But I have 2 small children, and so modern conveniences that fossil fuels bring is often at the top of my mind. These machines all exhale carbon dioxide. Airplanes that take you to see family and friends or to educational conferences burn fossil fuels and release carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Tractors, combines, harvesters that bring plentiful food to our tables exhale carbon dioxide. The diggers and cranes that build our houses and indoor buildings exhale it. The factories that make your shoes and your iPhone exhale it. The lights that you flick on at your convenience so that you can work and play at night are likely fired by likely come from a coal-fired power plant that releases carbon dioxide as a byproduct into the atmosphere. These machines make our spectacular lives possible. They extend our lives. And in a way, they are extensions of our lives. In a way, they represent the breadth of our superhuman selves. But our use of them changes nature. Specifically, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has risen from about 270 to 400 parts per million in the last 100 years. And the global average temperature has risen about 1 degree Celsius in the last 150 years or so. And human activity is responsible for likely most of that. We know also that fossil fuels make our lives better, incredibly better. So how do we judge whether this change in nature is good or bad? Environmentalists believe, and this is what I think is the prominent idea in the culture, that any change that we make to nature is evil. That's why, as Dr. Delegates pointed out, the benefits of increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, such as warming and plant greening, are usually completely ignored. And even the giant mountain of gold benefits that burning fossil fuels bring to our lives is often met with a kind of indifference. So the most prominent idea when it comes to energy is that what makes an action good or evil is to the extent that it impacts nature. This is promulgated by prominent environmentalists. They believe that any human-induced change is bad. And for most people, this picture of the world resonates with them because they've accepted this moral premise that it is evil to change nature. And if you do, mankind will get his comeuppance. Ocean levels will rise, storms will rage, and we'll all burn up, as one prominent environmentalist, Bill McKibben, put it. I reject this moral picture, and not only, I reject it in two ways. One is scientifically. I don't think that the evidence bears this picture of the world out, but also I reject it morally, because I think that the standard of what we call good and evil should be the flourishing of individual human beings, their ability to live longer, safer, healthier, and happier lives. And by that standard, fossil fuels are an overwhelming positive, and humans are safer from the climate than ever before. In the last 30 years around the globe, people have increased the burning of fossil fuels by a factor of about 2 times. In China and India, that went up by a factor of 5. And this has led to a legendary improvement in people's lives. In China and India, for example, the average life expectancy has gone up by about 10 years. Igor Goklani has pointed out that death from climate, things like extreme heat, cold, floods, has gone down by 98% in the last 80 years or so. People are safer from the climate. They're better off, and they're better off to the extent that they have more cheap, reliable, plentiful energy. But it is important to be clear on the risks and benefits of technology, fossil fuels included. The greenhouse effect is real, and we need to consider carefully what effect the carbon dioxide has on our atmosphere because we care about individual human beings, about their prosperity and their safety. If it turned out that mankind was destroying our ability to thrive by burning fossil fuels, that would be a horrible tragedy. I don't think that's the case. But we need to think about the question and examine it for ourselves. Because what we're being asked to give up is huge. It's the life-saving and life-enhancing benefits of the cheap, reliable, and plentiful energy that fossil fuels represent. So even as I stand here on a panel on climate science, I hope to remind you of what it's all for. Because if we forget, debating about the effects of carbon dioxide, what the climate models do or don't show, how big or small lobsters are getting, is all going to be a giant waste of time. Benjamin Franklin and his men went around the world giving demonstrations of lightning rods. and perhaps more importantly, answering the moral question about whether lightning rods were impious interference with nature. People are motivated by morality. Part of the job of advocating for truth and reason in the climate change debate is engaging in the question of morality. Is it morally right to interfere with nature? Benjamin Franklin certainly had an answer to that, and he wrote and spoke about it. If you care about human beings, the answer when it comes to burning fossil fuels is yes. Fossil fuels power our spectacular lives, and it is moral to live those lives to the best and longest extent possible. The morality that says it's wrong to change or interfere with nature will come at the expense of human life. As an astronomer, I'm often asked what I think the future will be like. Will we burn fossil fuels for how long? Will a better source of energy, an even better one, come along? All that I know for sure is that the future will be fantastic if capitalism survives, if we leave people free to innovate and to better their lives, and more importantly, encourage them to be proud to do so. Newton said, Isaac Newton, that he had seen further by standing on the shoulders of giants. And whereas our scientific knowledge in this day and age has made great strides forward, I think maybe our moral knowledge has not. It's time to step up and see further. I invite you to join me. Thank you very much.
You didn't see the timer, but Amanda just did a 15-minute talk in exactly 15 minutes. It hit 0 and she stopped. I can guarantee you won't get such performance from me. But I will try to keep it brief. For those who know me, usually I give a talk on the science of climate change. I'm most interested in how much has it warmed, and especially why it has warmed in recent decades, and what the level of warming we've seen means in terms of how much the climate system cares about the CO2 we're putting in the atmosphere. To do those talks, I usually use charts and graphs, and I'm very comfortable dealing with charts and graphs. I think it comes from my 15 years at NASA, where, making pretty charts was how you progressed in NASA. And then I went to the university. But today I've been asked to talk about something a little different that I'm very uncomfortable with, and I'm going to be using word charts. So you'll excuse me if we have to follow along together with the word charts. Let's see if we can get this thing to work. There is an alarmist bias in global warming research that I think has somewhat corrupted the academic community. By academic community, I mean the portion of the academic community that does scientific research, but also those who teach what comes out of the science. Don't give my talk for me yet. Here, I'll get to it. Anyway, this bias, in my experience, is almost 100% funded by government, and it's based on desired policy incomes. During the lunch, which we're working up to after my talk, I'll tell a little story to back this up, but I won't waste my time with it right now. The government does have desired policy outcomes, and as far as the scientific community is concerned, you don't get money to study non-problems. So the scientific community wants to have problems to study, which means you convince Congress to give you a lot of money to study a problem. And if we're destroying the environment, and this is a long-term problem, that gives people like me the chance to have a career funded studying the problem. Now, this has led to sort of an unholy alliance between the government and the scientific community. It's something that President Eisenhower predicted in his farewell address in 1961, talking about, because back then there was more of a tendency to have large government-funded projects. He said, "Today, the solitary inventor tinkering in his shop has been overshadowed by task forces of scientists in laboratories and testing fields. partly because of the huge costs involved. So think about these big $100 million or even $1 billion climate modeling efforts. A government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. I mean, it becomes an end in and of itself, and it must be perpetuated so that people that start in this business can carry out their careers in this business. Now, he also said something else that was really interesting. We must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite. And that's what we see in the climate research community today. I know some of the people involved in this. It's a minority of outspoken scientists who decide to sort of go down the policy and political path with their futures, and they become spokespersons for the community, whether the community likes it or not. So there's a bias towards an alarmist interpretation of climate data, and this benefits university researchers because you get an endless source of funding. It also benefits the government managers in the government because, you know, those people have to have a reason for their job too. I used to be on that side of the fence. Politicians see it as a way to increase power, taxation, and they get to choose winners and losers in the process. And then there's also this worldview or almost semi-religious underpinning of what people believe about climate change. All of these things are mixed together, and different people have different motivations, but you will find almost without exception in the earth science community in general, just about anybody that works in earth science as a scientist believes that nature is fragile, okay? And that we shouldn't be messing with nature. Well, that has nothing to do with science. And that fundamental worldview affects how they look at data. I've told people over and over the years, we could have perfect data every day of the entire climate system, ocean, atmosphere, everywhere, every minute, with no errors, and scientists would still disagree about what all that data means in terms of cause and effect, and can come to totally opposite conclusions on the science. Okay, so this bias has been known to us skeptical researchers since the 1990s and was revealed to the world after the ClimateGate email release in November of 2009. For instance, in an email from Phil Jones to Michael Mann, speaking of some skeptics like myself, but not myself, who were trying to get papers published, Phil Jones said, "I can't see either of these papers being in the next IPCC report. Kevin Trenberth and I will keep them out somehow, even if we have to redefine what the peer-reviewed literature is." This is bad behavior on the part of scientists. It's something we knew was going on, myself, John Christie, other credentialed and publishing skeptical scientists. It just is now the rest of the world found out. Now, even with the Trump administration, the situation has not improved very much, not yet, because the swamp is indeed wide, deep, and outlasts the tenure of elected officials, which mostly populate the government. So, you know, while things might be looking better in certain areas, you know, elected officials are only there for a short period of time, and it will, you know, eventually the pendulum will probably swing in the other direction, and we need to be prepared for that. So the people that are really in charge of how much money the skeptics get versus the alarmist scientists get is dependent mainly on the people, the government employees who are lifetime employees in whether it's NASA or NOAA or the Department of Energy, National Science Foundation. They're the ones that really will determine who gets what money. And as I have often said, a scientist who is funded to find evidence for a human influence on climate will do his best to find evidence for a human influence on climate. Okay, that's what he's being paid to do. And if only the government were to put some portion of that research money into looking for evidence of natural causes of climate change, they would find evidence for that too. But the government, generally speaking, does not fund the latter category of research. Another problem is the scientific establishment ends up being the peers who decide which proposals get funded and what papers get published. This is something that President Eisenhower warned against. You know, that once you get an entrenched group of scientists deciding which way things are going to go, that has a huge impact on what gets funded by the government, because the government just turns around and asks the scientists, should we fund this? And the scientists will say, yeah, you know, that keeps us going. Well, is there any good news in scientific research in terms of bias? Well, at least the public isn't that concerned. In the latest Gallup poll of important problems facing the country, none of the 36 ones included climate change. The public really doesn't consider climate change to be on their radar screen. Sorry, I'm a meteorologist by training. You know, the reason is global warming is so slight. The rate of global warming, even if you believe the climate models, which are currently running twice as hot as they should, even if you believe them, the rate of global warming really isn't quite enough for any human to feel in their lifetimes. You know, severe weather hasn't gotten worse. I don't care what the media says. Droughts, floods haven't gotten worse. Tornadoes have gotten better. You know, this is all the science that this meeting wasn't about. I just thought I would point them out. So it's no wonder that the public isn't alarmed. So that's some good news, because ultimately, the government, to the extent that that our representatives follow what the public wants, the public still has some control. Also, there are a handful of important papers that have appeared. It's not like all of the papers that get published are alarmist. Lewis and Curry, Nick Lewis and Judy Curry, updated their calculations of how much warming we can expect from increasing CO2. And they come up with a number, and this is some of the best, most fundamental science, I think, that's been done with observations. They come up with a number which says that the climate models on which energy policy is being based, are warming the Earth at twice the rate they should be. And that assumes all of the warming is due to humans. They make the assumption all the warming is due to humans, and still it's only warming at half the rate. That's the surface of the Earth and the deep oceans. So automatically, the problem's only 50% of what the people are being told. And then what if that 50% is partly natural? Then it becomes even a smaller problem. These are things that are published. It's out there in the literature, but it's never mentioned in the media, so the public generally isn't aware of it. And one little piece of good news, you know, in the last 25 years that John Christie and I have been doing this work, it's been harder and harder for us to get funding out of the federal government, because we are now considered the enemy because we get the wrong answer in our research. Well, it's probably more than a coincidence that it's during the Trump administration that the Department of Energy has just funded one of our proposals. It probably wouldn't have happened without the current administration. So that's a baby step in the right direction. What's the bad news? The average age of credentialed climate scientists like myself who publish in peer-reviewed journals is now about 65 or 70. Somewhere in there, that's just my guesstimate. We're slowly dying off. I gave a talk on the French Riviera at the invitation of Peter Thiel a couple of months ago, and a Nobel Prize winning physicist who was sitting in the front row after I gave my talk said, "It's good that people like you are dying." Of course, he's 20 years older than me. He says, "It's good that people like you are dying, because when you die out, then we can finally make progress on global warming." And he knows because he's taught 2 semesters of climate science. Oh. And there are no new skeptical researchers coming up through the ranks, unless they stay in the closet, because generally speaking, you can't get a proposal funded from the federal government by making it overtly skeptical, okay? It also doesn't help that we don't have big name donors with lots of cash, like George Soros or Tom Steyer, who have a history of putting money into the efforts on the other side of the issue, on the alarmist side of the issue. So that doesn't help us either. Petroleum companies don't have to fund us, okay? They don't fund us because they know everyone is going to need to go fill up their tank anyway. You know, there's no point in them getting, you know, putting out ads on TV advocating for fossil fuels or hydrocarbon-based fuels, or maybe we should call it hydrofuels. If CO2 can be mischaracterized as carbon, right, by dropping the O, the oxygen, how about if we take hydrocarbons, drop the carbon, call it hydrofuels? There you go. Okay. So, at the end of my talk, I hope this isn't the end, which this is a picture of John Christie, who is my co-researcher, co-worker, and also my boss, looking at one of the 7 bullets that was fired into our building a year ago on the weekend of the March for Science. And let's hope that's not the demise of the skeptics. Let's hope that's not the way we go out. And that's all I have to say. We can get very different amounts, you know, depending on how we treat that, we get very, very different amounts of global warming. In other words, there are processes in the atmosphere that we do not understand. They put a fudge number into the model to make it work and then end up, you know, tuning it until they get about the right amount of warming. Well, and they don't tell you that, okay? This is biased science that never comes out, okay? And Hal brought up a very important point, which is that you are going to see in the next IPCC report probably more and more reliance on climate models, which are totally incomprehensible to everyone because they got millions of lines of computer code in them, okay, and all kinds of assumptions. How do you test that? They're going to say, we trust the models, and you shouldn't believe the observations. That's a very dangerous direction for science.
Before I recognize Sterling Burnett, the editor of Environment and Climate News, with the second question, I'm a terrible name dropper, and I love to drop Hal Doran's name and Tom Weissmuller's name, who's in the second row. They've landed essentially every single astronaut on the moon with their computer programs. It's just an honor to have them here in the audience. Sterling.
Yes. This is for David. You know, I've been covering this for a long time. I know all the great stuff about the greening of the earth, but still people persist in saying bad things about the greening of the earth. And most recently, July 30th, the New York Times had an article, got a lot of coverage, that global greening sounds good in the long run. It's terrible, and they give 4 reasons. I'm sure you saw the article. Do you have any responses? Because I think it's an important thing that we need to respond to when they make these claims that somehow the fact that plants are doing better is bad for us.
Right. And right. You do this?
You got it. It's on. Go.
Just talk. Okay. Yeah. Right. So the argument is essentially that we can't hear these kinds of things. I mean, I can't remember all 4 of them off the top of my head.
It's not working.
Now is it better?
No. Yeah, maybe.
Well, I can't get much closer than this.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, okay. All right. So let's get within half an inch apparently. Okay. So I can't remember all 4 of them, but I remember the argument is, you know, to some extent that if certain plants grow better, but weeds grow better too, and so therefore they will choke out the good plants. And there's all sorts of arguments like that. I mean, the point, of course, is you've got to counter every argument with a counter argument, even if it's silly. And that's why the problem comes down to, like Hal said, the idea is that models take over because models can be controlled. It's very difficult to show in observations a change. I've got a paper I'm trying to publish, been trying to publish for 2 years now with precipitation, where you've got a jump discontinuity, and I know it's because of the ASOS modernization program in precipitation. I can demonstrate it. It happens. precipitation should be increasing, so you must be wrong because you disagree with the models. I mean, that's the argument, is that every answer has to be met with a counter argument. And that's how they come up with these counter arguments, is that, yeah, but bugs will get bigger. And so we'll be overrun by cockroaches and all sorts of other things in addition to the huge blue crabs.
I don't know how many of you remember the Russian newspaper Izvestia in the days of the Soviet Union, but that's what I call the New York Times now. Sam, what was back there? Okay.
Hi, Ed Emery from Missouri. I was just curious, when your modelers are questioned about history matching their models, what answers do they give?
Roy?
When the modelers are questioned about what?
The history that doesn't match.
Oh, that's an excellent question. And if you ever find someone that knows the answer, would you let me know?
Yeah.
It astounds me that the models